She walked into the office wearing a long navy dress and flats, her hand resting lightly over her growing belly. She was exactly 34 weeks pregnant, and while her body ached, her spirit was steady. She had applied for the marketing director role at Easton and Holt, a rising name in boutique branding with clients ranging from skincare startups to luxury cafes. The job was a perfect fit. She had 10 years of experience, stellar references, and a portfolio that spoke for itself. Still, as she stepped into the glass-paneled conference room, she felt the air shift. The lead interviewer, a man in his early 50s with slicked back hair and a polished gray suit, looked her over with a practiced smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He extended a hand, but it was more out of obligation than welcome. "We appreciate your time today," he said, motioning for her to sit. As she lowered herself into the chair, she noticed the other panelists, two younger associates and one human resources representative, glance at each other. Something unspoken passed between them. The questions started politely enough: her experience managing product launches, her past leadership roles, her thoughts on multi-platform strategy, but before long, the mood changed. "You mentioned you are expecting," the lead interviewer said, almost casually, his voice coded in professionalism. "Would you say that impacts your ability to handle high-pressure deadlines or extended hours?" She blinked, caught off guard. "I am due in 6 weeks, but I plan to be back after my leave, fully committed." The room went quiet for a moment too long. Another panelist spoke next, his voice lighter. "We are just trying to assess cultural fit. Our office moves very fast. Things can get intense." She nodded, offering a calm smile. "I have led national campaigns while raising a toddler. I know how to keep up." But it was clear that was not what they wanted to hear. They had already made a judgment. The final question from the human resources woman was soft but sharp. "How would you handle client meetings if your child had an emergency?" That was when she knew. The decision had been made before she walked through the door. The rest of the interview was a formality. They wrapped up within minutes. She stood, thanked them, and walked out with her shoulders straight, even as her heart clenched. In the lobby, she paused for a moment, looking around at the sleek furniture and polished floors. On her way out, the receptionist gave her a small, pitying smile. No one had said it outright, but it had been written all over their faces. To them, she was a liability, a complication, a pregnant woman asking for too much. She stepped into the sunlight, blinking back the sting of humiliation, and made her way to the parking garage. She drove home in silence, the soft hum of the car the only sound. Her phone buzzed twice with well-meaning texts from friends who knew about the interview. She did not reply. When she pulled into the driveway of their restored brownstone, the familiar sight of home gave her a moment of peace. Inside, the kitchen smelled of fresh herbs and lemon. She set down her bag, walked to the back patio, and found her husband trimming a small potted tree. Ethan Collins looked up and immediately noticed something was off. "Bad?" he asked simply. She nodded. "Worse than I expected?" She sat down carefully, and as he poured her a glass of iced water, she recounted the entire experience. Every patronizing glance, every coded question, every disingenuous smile. Ethan listened, eyes narrowing, but he did not interrupt. When she finished, she added, "They saw me walk in and decided I could not handle it. They made sure I knew I did not belong." Ethan set down the pitcher with a deliberate calm. "You do not have to prove anything to anyone," he said. She smiled faintly, tired but grateful. "I know, but it should not be like this. They cannot just get away with it. Not forever." Ethan leaned back, his fingers drumming softly on the table. She had seen that look before, measured, thoughtful, and just a little dangerous. "You know," he said slowly, "Easton and Holt just took on a new investor. They closed a quiet round last month." She raised an eyebrow. "You?" He nodded. "One of my subsidiaries. I have not paid them much attention, until now." She watched him carefully. "Ethan, I do not need revenge." "I know," he replied, "but you deserve justice, and maybe, just maybe, they deserve a lesson." Over the next 24 hours, Ethan made a series of quiet calls. Not loud, not public, just strategic. The kind that powerful people make when they want to shift the winds without anyone noticing who moved the air. Meanwhile, she returned to her normal rhythm. Prenatal yoga, checking in with her freelance clients, organizing the nursery. Life moved forward, but something had shifted. The next morning, Easton and Holt's office buzzed with news. The founder, Meredith Holt, was flying in early. There was talk of restructuring. Meetings were rearranged. The energy was tense, uncertain, and then the email came. A mandatory company-wide meeting at 10:30 sharp. No explanation, just attendance required. At 10:30, the staff gathered in the large meeting space. The interview panel was seated near the front, fidgeting. The lead interviewer adjusted his tie 3 times. Meredith Holt entered, flanked by 2 unfamiliar men in tailored suits. They looked like lawyers, or worse, investors. She stepped up, calm and firm. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice cool. "There has been a recent review of our hiring practices. A situation came to my attention involving a candidate who was not treated in accordance with our stated values." The room fell still. Eyes darted nervously. Meredith continued, "Let me be clear. Easton and Holt does not tolerate discrimination, not based on race, not based on gender, and certainly not based on pregnancy." She turned her gaze to the lead interviewer, who paled visibly. "A formal complaint has been filed, and after reviewing transcripts, we have made a decision." The silence deepened. "Effective immediately, there will be changes in management. A new policy training protocol will be implemented, and certain individuals will be placed on indefinite leave pending further investigation." A wave of whispers rippled through the room, but no one dared speak aloud. The lead interviewer sat motionless, his face a portrait of disbelief and rising panic. One of the suits beside Meredith stepped forward. "We represent the new majority stakeholders," he said calmly, "and we expect Easton and Holt to not only perform, but to uphold the standards of dignity and inclusivity it claims to value. The incident that occurred in this very office 2 days ago is now being reviewed at the highest level." He paused just long enough for the weight of his words to settle. "There will be accountability." The human resources director visibly shrank in her seat. The younger associates glanced at each other, both pale. No names were spoken, but everyone in the room knew exactly who the statement referred to. Meredith resumed her place, adding one final note. "We all make mistakes," she said, "but growth begins with acknowledging them. Let this be a turning point." And then the meeting was over. Just like that. The leadership team was escorted out, one by one. The mood in the building shifted from confusion to shock, then to something else, something quieter, heavier. Change had arrived, swift and undeniable. In a private conference room 2 floors up, Ethan Collins watched the scene unfold through a live stream sent to his inbox. He sat with a quiet expression, fingers laced, eyes focused. When the stream ended, he did not smile. He simply forwarded the video to his wife with a short message. Justice delivered, but not over yet. Back at home, she sat on the porch in the fading afternoon light, the phone resting on her knee. She read his message twice, then watched the video, every moment confirming what she already knew deep down, that she had not imagined the disrespect and that someone had finally been held accountable. She breathed in slowly, her hand once again resting on the life growing inside her. The world would not change overnight, but today was a start. 3 weeks passed. The story never made headlines. There were no viral videos, no dramatic public takedowns. Ethan had ensured discretion. What mattered was not spectacle, it was transformation. Behind closed doors, Easton and Holt introduced new hiring protocols. A third-party consultant was brought in to review company culture. Anonymous employee feedback revealed patterns of quiet bias that had long gone unaddressed. Changes were not just made, they were felt. And then, just as the dust had started to settle, a new opportunity emerged. An independent foundation focused on supporting women re-entering the workforce after childbirth was planning a national conference. They wanted her, specifically, to lead a keynote panel. At first, she hesitated. She had never been one to seek the spotlight, but something about this felt right. She accepted. When the day arrived, the auditorium was filled with women, some expecting, some cradling infants, some clutching notebooks filled with hope. She walked on stage in a tailored navy dress, the same color as the one she wore the day of the interview. Her belly was now full, her stride slower but strong. She began by sharing her story, not as a victim, but as a woman who had been underestimated, dismissed, and who had refused to let others define her value. She spoke about bias, about dignity, about the power of quiet resilience. She did not name the company. She did not need to. The audience understood. And when she finished, the room erupted in applause that felt less like celebration and more like recognition. Ethan stood in the wings watching. He had seen his wife in many roles, partner, mother, advocate, but never quite like this. She was radiant, not just with the glow of pregnancy, but with purpose. Later that evening, as they drove home under a soft orange sky, she turned to him. "Thank you," she said, "for listening, for standing beside me, for believing in something better." He reached for her hand, their fingers locking together naturally. "You are the one who made them pay," he said. "I just gave them the bill." The days that followed brought unexpected ripple effects. Messages poured into her inbox, some from strangers who had heard about her quiet but powerful speech, others from former colleagues who had admired her for years. A few were from women who had sat across from the same interview panel and felt the same sting of judgment. They thanked her for saying what they never could. But it was not the praise that moved her most. It was the sense of solidarity. She began working with the foundation on an ongoing basis, helping design mentorship programs and childcare support networks for working mothers. Her days were full but purposeful, and even as she prepared for the baby's arrival, her energy remained steady. Then, one morning, she received a letter. Not an email, but a handwritten note delivered by courier. The envelope was cream-colored and embossed with the Easton and Holt insignia. Inside was a single page. The new interim director thanked her, not with apologies or platitudes, but with an honest acknowledgement. The company had failed her, and because of her, it was beginning to change. Enclosed was an offer, consultant advisor to their board on maternal policy and inclusivity. She read it twice, then laid it down on the table. She did not need the position. She did not crave the title, but she understood what it meant. A door, once slammed in her face, was now open. That afternoon, as the rain tapped gently against the window panes, she sat beside Ethan and reviewed the offer in detail. "It is not about them anymore," she said. "It is about what comes next." He nodded. "That is always what it has been about." She accepted the offer on her terms. Flexible hours, full creative oversight, a guarantee that she could bring in experts of her choosing, and one more condition. Every intern hired would be interviewed by a 3-person panel that included at least one mother who had re-entered the workforce. The company agreed without hesitation. They had learned their lesson. At the next quarterly board meeting, she arrived not as an applicant, but as an equal. She wore the same navy dress, now tailored post-pregnancy, with her baby wrapped against her chest in a sling. When she entered the room, the same conference table stood before her, but this time the atmosphere had changed. She was not just welcome, she was wanted. It was Daniel, a junior analyst barely out of graduate school, who said what everyone else was thinking. "This feels different," he remarked quietly to his colleague as she took her seat at the table. And it was. No more hushed glances, no more hesitant smiles. The culture had begun to shift. Slowly, yes, but undeniably. During that board meeting, she laid out a comprehensive roadmap, not just for inclusive hiring, but for retaining talent that often fell through the cracks. Working parents, neurodiverse professionals, people re-entering the workforce after extended health leave. Every proposal she made was backed by research, but it was her conviction that made the room listen. She spoke with clarity and calm resolve, never asking for permission, only partnership. And when it was over, there was no vote needed. The board embraced every change she proposed. Afterward, as she stepped outside into the crisp autumn air, she paused on the steps. The baby stirred lightly in the sling, and she adjusted it with gentle hands. It was strange to think how everything had begun with one humiliating interview. And yet here she stood, not in spite of it, but because of it. Ethan arrived moments later, walking briskly from his car. "How did it go?" he asked. She smiled. "They listened, really listened." He grinned. "I would expect nothing less." Together, they walked to the car, not saying much but sharing something weightier than words, a kind of quiet victory. Not one shouted from rooftops or posted on social media, but one lived, one that changed things not for a moment, but for the long haul. Over the following months, Ethan kept his distance from Easton and Holt's daily operations. He had never wanted to be the shadow behind the curtain. This was her story, not his. But he kept watching, quietly ensuring that promises made became actions fulfilled. When employees reached out to share positive changes, he would forward the messages to her. She always responded the same way, with a nod, a smile, and a steady reminder. This is just the beginning. 1 month later, the foundation she partnered with hosted its largest event yet, a summit titled Return and Rise, focused on workplace reintegration for mothers. The venue was packed with industry leaders, nonprofit organizers, HR executives, and dozens of women who had faced the very barriers she once had. There were panels, breakout sessions, and keynote addresses, but what people remembered most was a quiet conversation at the end of the second day. She had just stepped off stage after moderating a session on parental leave design when a young woman approached her. She looked barely out of college, holding a notebook so tightly the edges were frayed. "I just wanted to say thank you," the woman said, her voice trembling. "I applied for an internship at Easton and Holt last year. I did not even get a reply, but this year I got in. They said my interview panel included a working mother who understood what I had been through, and she actually asked me about my experience balancing night shifts and childcare instead of questioning my reliability." She paused, then smiled. "I start next week." That single exchange, brief and sincere, reminded her why it had all been worth it. Not because her name had entered news circles or because companies were finally listening, but because someone else now had a chance she never did. That night, as she walked through the quiet venue with Ethan by her side, she paused in front of the stage one last time. The lights were dimmed, the chairs stacked. "It still does not feel like enough," she said softly. "Then keep going," Ethan replied. "Keep going until it does." The next morning, Easton and Holt released a formal update on its hiring and workplace equity practices, naming her as their ongoing lead advisor. It was a public announcement this time, with a press release and media coverage. Her photo appeared in several industry newsletters. Some called her a disruptor. Others called her a trailblazer. But she just smiled, closed the tabs, and returned to her daughter, who was now wide awake and clutching a rattle with curious hands. Not long after, she was invited to attend a roundtable discussion hosted by a coalition of executives aiming to revise national parental leave guidelines in the private sector. It was the kind of meeting that once felt far out of reach. Executives in suits, government policy liaisons, and attorneys who had never known what it felt like to be overlooked simply for carrying a child. But she walked into that room with the same calm confidence she had built over years of proving herself. She did not raise her voice. She did not bring an entourage. What she brought was lived experience, data, and a vision. When one executive pushed back, suggesting too generous policies might disrupt productivity, she leaned in and replied, "If your definition of productivity cannot include people building families, it is time to redefine productivity." The room went still, and then slowly, people began to nod. That meeting led to more meetings. Those meetings led to new language and corporate pledges, and those pledges began to turn into pilot programs across half a dozen major companies. Nothing about it was instant, but it was real, and it grew. Back at home, the balance was not always perfect. Some nights the baby refused to sleep. Some mornings she questioned whether it was all reaching far enough, but then she would read another email, another woman hired, another company policy revised, another young intern who finally saw herself in the room, and she would exhale, steady once again. Ethan watched all of it from the side, not as the architect of her success, but as its quiet witness. His role had never been to make her powerful. She already was. His role was to remove the barriers others had placed in her way, and he did it the only way he knew how, with resources, access, and just enough pressure to remind the powerful that wealth meant nothing if it could not be used for good. One evening, months after that first interview, he surprised her with a framed document. It was the original rejection email she had received from Easton and Holt, printed and sealed behind museum glass. She laughed at first, confused. "Why this?" she asked. "Because," Ethan said, placing it beside the baby's first photo. "That is where the change began." She kept that framed rejection letter on a shelf in her home office, not out of bitterness, not to gloat, but as a reminder that small moments of dismissal, of injustice, can be the start of something powerful. Whenever she glanced at it, she remembered the way her voice had trembled when she first told Ethan what had happened, how her cheeks had burned with shame that did not belong to her. Now, when women visited her office, new mothers, returning workers, those who had been laid off or passed over, they would sometimes ask about it. She would smile gently and say, "That was a no that led to everything that came after." The baby, now almost 6 months old, gurgled happily from her crib while she hosted video calls, her little feet kicking the air like punctuation marks. She had grown used to toggling between mother and advisor, between warm bottles and policy drafts. The balance was never easy, but it felt real. And in the middle of one particularly long day, she received an unexpected message from Daniel, the junior analyst who had witnessed her first interview. He had stayed at Easton and Holt and was now heading up their new internal mentorship program. His message was short, but meaningful. "Every time I speak to a candidate, I remember the way you stood your ground. Just wanted to say, thank you." She responded instantly. "You were the first to speak up. I never forgot." After she hit send, she sat back in her chair, watching the late afternoon sun stretch across the room. The fight was not over. There would always be more to do. But she was not doing it alone. The ripple effects of her quiet strength had become waves. Policies were shifting, cultures were softening, and stories like hers were becoming harder to ignore. She still walked into rooms where people underestimated her. But now, she walked in with history on her side. One weekend, Ethan invited her to a private retreat with several leaders from the startup world, mostly investors, founders, and philanthropists looking to align their capital with impact. She hesitated. It was not her scene. But he gently encouraged her. "You have more to say than most of them, and they need to hear it." So she went. And when a founder half-jokingly asked if she ever planned to build her own firm, she replied, "I already have. It just does not sell products. It changes minds." The silence that followed said everything. Later that night, several attendees sought her out. They asked real questions about inclusion, equity, how to make space instead of simply checking boxes. One even invited her to join a council advising early-stage founders on workplace culture. She accepted with cautious optimism, knowing that real change often came from the margins. That same month, Easton and Holt unveiled their first internal report tracking employee wellness and inclusivity. For the first time in its history, the company publicly released metrics on parental retention, satisfaction, and support. She read it with care, noting both the progress and the gaps. There was still work to be done. But the difference now was accountability. The very people who once dismissed her were now implementing her ideas. At a board meeting that quarter, one senior partner stood and said, "This culture shift is the most valuable transformation we have made in a decade." No one disagreed. When she returned home that evening, she found Ethan in the nursery reading to their daughter. He looked up, smiled, and asked, "Good meeting?" She nodded. "They are starting to understand." He kissed the baby's forehead and said, "Because you made them see it." She sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "It is still strange," she admitted, "how something so small, just a moment of being told I was not good enough, turned into all of this." He turned to her, voice warm but certain. "That was never small. It was a spark. All you did was refuse to let it go out." Weeks later, she stood on another stage, this time at a global summit on women in leadership. Her talk, titled "The Power of Being Underestimated," resonated far beyond the room. Clips of her speech were shared widely online, but it was not the viral moments that stayed with her. It was the quiet one afterward, when a seasoned executive approached her and said, "I have run teams for 20 years, and I have probably dismissed more women than I care to admit. Hearing you speak today made me rethink everything." That was the moment she knew. She was not just rewriting her own story. She was challenging others to rewrite theirs. Her daughter, just learning to stand, would grow up in a world shaped by those changes. Maybe not perfect, maybe not fast, but different, better. As she looked out over the audience that day, she felt no anger, no resentment, only resolve. The rejection that once made her doubt herself had become her greatest tool, not for revenge, but for revolution. In the months that followed, her influence grew beyond Easton and Holt. Word of her work spread across sectors. Law firms, media agencies, even financial institutions began reaching out for guidance on creating more inclusive workplaces. She never rushed to accept. Every invitation was weighed not by prestige, but by sincerity. She wanted nothing to do with tokenism or hollow branding exercises. If they were ready to listen, truly listen, she would speak, and when she did, she spoke plainly. "You do not need to fix women," she would say. "You need to fix the systems that punish them for existing." One media company, notorious for its burnout culture, brought her on for a 6-month engagement. By the end of the first quarter, they had implemented flexible scheduling, redesigned their parental leave plan, and established a leadership track specifically for caregivers returning to work. In private, some of the executives confessed that they had never considered these perspectives before. She did not shame them, she educated them, because she understood that progress came not from blame, but from rebuilding. At home, life was chaotic in the best way. Her daughter was crawling now, fast, curious, always reaching for the next thing. Some mornings were a blur of spilled cereal, missing socks, and last-minute changes to presentation slides. But it was hers, all of it. The balance was not perfect, but it was real, and it reminded her every single day what she was fighting for. Then, one autumn morning, she received an invitation that gave her pause. Easton and Holt was hosting its first ever Equity and Innovation Gala, a formal event celebrating the company's transformation and spotlighting the voices that had shaped it. She had not expected to be invited, but there her name was, printed at the top of the guest list, not just as an attendee, as the keynote speaker. She stared at the invitation for a long time, then set it down beside her morning coffee. When Ethan saw it, he raised an eyebrow. "Are you going to accept?" She nodded slowly. "I think I have to." The night of the gala arrived crisp and clear, with leaves swirling gently around the entrance to the downtown hall. She wore a deep burgundy dress, simple, elegant, chosen without apology. When she stepped through the front doors, the room quieted for just a moment. Conversations paused, people turned. Some recognized her immediately, others needed a moment longer, but every single person understood who she was. The same woman who had once walked into their conference room and been told she did not belong. Now she stood at the center of their celebration. When she took the stage, there was no theatrics, no dramatic music, just a microphone, a spotlight, and her voice. She began with a story, familiar, honest, and without embellishment. She spoke about the day she was turned away, about how it felt to be dismissed before she had even spoken, and then she spoke about what followed. The meetings, the policies, the people who chose to do better. She did not name names. She did not need to. The room already knew. "I am not here to be your exception," she said clearly. "I am here because too many others still are." The applause was long and sustained, not out of politeness, but out of recognition. After the speech, several current employees approached her, junior staffers, department heads, even members of human resources. They thanked her, not just for the changes she had helped bring, but for proving it was possible to speak up without burning down everything in the process. One woman, who was visibly pregnant herself, clutched her hand tightly. "I almost left last year," she said. "I thought I could not stay and be taken seriously. Then you showed up, and I stayed. I stayed because of you." That moment stayed with her longer than the applause, longer than the spotlight, because it confirmed what she had always believed, that change, when real, does not just trickle down. It reaches outward, it pulls others with it, and it makes space, real, tangible space. Later that evening, as she stood near the exit, Ethan joined her. "You ready to go?" he asked. She looked around the hall one last time. The laughter, the music, the people she had once viewed as untouchable, now standing as equals. "Yes," she said, "let's go home." The next morning, she woke up earlier than usual. The house was still quiet, the kind of peaceful silence that only came before the day began rushing in. She padded into the nursery, scooped her daughter up gently, and sat by the window as the sun rose over the rooftops. It was hard to believe how much had changed in under a year. From that first interview, from the sting of rejection she had carried home in silence, to the boardrooms, summits, and keynote addresses she now walked into with clarity and purpose. She had become a symbol for something bigger than herself, not because she sought it, but because she refused to let the world silence her. And yet, in the quiet of that morning, she did not feel like a leader or an activist. She just felt like a woman who had chosen not to back down. Ethan found her a few minutes later, coffee in one hand, his other resting lightly on her shoulder. "I do not say this enough," he told her, "but watching you change the world one conversation at a time, it is the most incredible thing I have ever seen." She smiled, kissed his cheek, and whispered, "You helped me believe I could." Later that day, she attended a roundtable for a corporate diversity initiative. The organizers had selected her to moderate a session titled Creating Culture Through Policy, and she walked in prepared, steady, and unbothered by the handful of executives who still looked at her with caution. She knew by now that change never came from making people comfortable. It came from making them reflect, and that required discomfort. She opened the session with a single sentence: "We do not build better workplaces by protecting systems. We build them by challenging assumptions." It was not confrontational, it was honest, and it made people sit up. Over the course of 2 hours, she listened, pushed, offered data, and guided the conversation towards something meaningful. And when it was over, several attendees admitted they had come expecting a surface-level discussion. They had not expected to leave rethinking their entire framework for hiring and retention. That evening, back home, she pulled out the framed rejection letter again. Not to dwell, just to look. She read the first line and felt nothing sting in her chest anymore. No bitterness, no regret, just clarity. That letter had marked the beginning of everything. It was proof that sometimes the door that shuts in your face is the one that forces you to build an entirely new house, a better one. That weekend, she and Ethan took their daughter to a local family festival. No press, no meetings, no stages. Just cotton candy, hay bales, and music drifting from a small folk band under the trees. A few people recognized her from her speech at the summit and waved politely, but no one interrupted. She appreciated that. Here she could just be a mother, walking hand in hand with her husband, carrying a diaper bag and adjusting a sun hat on her baby's tiny head. It was these moments that reminded her of the world she wanted to help build, not one where women had to choose between career and family or hide parts of themselves to be respected, but one where they could be full, complex people without apology, where being a parent was not a disqualification, but a strength. As the sun set and they packed up to leave, Ethan turned to her and asked, "If you could go back to that interview, would you do anything differently?" She thought about it, about the way she had sat in that room trying to prove she belonged to people who had already decided she did not. "No," she said finally, "not a single thing. I would still show up exactly as I was." He smiled. "Good. Because that woman, she started something powerful." She nodded. "And I am not done yet." Back at home, after they tucked their daughter into bed, she sat down to draft a new proposal. This one for a national maternal mentorship network. It would connect women who had returned to work after childbirth with others preparing to do the same. The idea had come to her weeks ago, but tonight it burned in her chest like something urgent. She typed well past midnight, focused, driven, certain. Not because someone had told her to, but because somewhere out there, another woman was about to be told she was not enough. And when that happened, she wanted the world waiting on the other side to look different. The next morning, she woke up earlier than usual. The house was still quiet, the kind of peaceful silence that only came before the day began rushing in. She padded into the nursery, scooped her daughter up gently, and sat by the window as the sun rose over the rooftops. It was hard to believe how much had changed in under a year. From that first interview, from the sting of rejection she had carried home in silence, to the boardrooms, summits, and keynote addresses she now walked into with clarity and purpose. She had become a symbol for something bigger than herself, not because she sought it, but because she refused to let the world silence her. And yet, in the quiet of that morning, she did not feel like a leader or an activist. She just felt like a woman who had chosen not to back down. Ethan found her a few minutes later, coffee in one hand, his other resting lightly on her shoulder. "I do not say this enough," he told her, "but watching you change the world one conversation at a time, it is the most incredible thing I have ever seen." She smiled, kissed his cheek, and whispered, "You helped me believe I could." Later that day, she attended a roundtable for a corporate diversity initiative. The organizers had selected her to moderate a session titled "Creating Culture Through Policy." And she walked in prepared, steady, and unbothered by the handful of executives who still looked at her with caution. She knew by now that change never came from making people comfortable. It came from making them reflect, and that required discomfort. She opened the session with a single sentence. "We do not build better workplaces by protecting systems. We build them by challenging assumptions." It was not confrontational. It was honest, and it made people sit up. Over the course of 2 hours, she listened, pushed, offered data, and guided the conversation towards something meaningful. And when it was over, several attendees admitted they had come expecting a surface-level discussion. They had not expected to leave rethinking their entire framework for hiring and retention. That evening back home, she pulled out the framed rejection letter again, not to dwell, just to look. She read the first line and felt nothing sting in her chest anymore. No bitterness, no regret, just clarity. That letter had marked the beginning of everything. It was proof that sometimes the door that shuts in your face is the one that forces you to build an entirely new house, a better one. That weekend, she and Ethan took their daughter to a local family festival. No press, no meetings, no stages. Just cotton candy, hay bales, and music drifting from a small folk band under the trees. A few people recognized her from her speech at the summit and waved politely, but no one interrupted. She appreciated that. Here, she could just be a mother, walking hand in hand with her husband, carrying a diaper bag and adjusting a sun hat on her baby's tiny head. It was these moments that reminded her of the world she wanted to help build. Not one where women had to choose between career and family or hide parts of themselves to be respected, but one where they could be full, complex people without apology, where being a parent was not a disqualification, but a strength. As the sun set and they packed up to leave, Ethan turned to her and asked, "If you could go back to that interview, would you do anything differently?" She thought about it. About the way she had sat in that room, trying to prove she belonged to people who had already decided she did not. "No," she said finally. "Not a single thing. I would still show up exactly as I was." He smiled. "Good. Because that woman, she started something powerful." She nodded. "And I am not done yet." Back at home, after they tucked their daughter into bed, she sat down to draft a new proposal. This one for a national maternal mentorship network. It would connect women who had returned to work after childbirth with others preparing to do the same. The idea had come to her weeks ago, but tonight it burned in her chest like something urgent. She typed well past midnight, focused, driven, certain, not because someone had told her to, but because somewhere out there another woman was about to be told she was not enough. And when that happened, she wanted the world waiting on the other side to look different. Weeks after the National Forum, she received an unexpected invitation to visit a university where a group of students had started a campus initiative inspired by her story. The program was called Not Asking Permission, and it focused on preparing women for the realities of the workforce through resume clinics, mock interviews, policy briefings, and leadership workshops. The students had gathered donations, secured faculty sponsorship, and reached out to local businesses for internships. It was grassroots, clunky in places, still learning, but it was real, and it was growing. She flew out quietly, without press or fanfare, and sat in on a workshop held in a small classroom with flickering overhead lights and too few chairs. One of the students, no older than 22, stood at the front practicing how to negotiate salary. Her voice was shaky at first, but by the second round, she was steady, confident. And when she looked across the room and saw her guest watching from the back, she smiled, not with nerves, but with pride. Afterward, over lukewarm coffee and peanut butter crackers, The students asked her questions about how she had handled fear, rejection, and being underestimated again and again. "It never stops being frustrating," she said honestly. "But the more you speak, the more you show up anyway. The more you build the muscle of not shrinking. And then one day, you are not afraid of their doubt anymore. You are just bored by it." The room erupted in laughter, not because it was funny, but because it was true. That visit stayed with her for days. It reminded her that while change at the top mattered, change at the roots mattered more. If these young women could start their journeys already knowing that they belonged, really deeply believing it, then maybe, just maybe, the cycle could finally break. That same week, she finalized the early plans for an annual summit that would bring together women from every stage of the workforce, from interns to CEOs, from nonprofit workers to entrepreneurs. It would not be about polished speeches or brand partnerships. It would be about what happened in the in-between, in the hallway conversations, in the late-night emails, in the choice to come back after being told you were too much, too soon, too tired, too late. She named the event The Return, because it was not just about returning to work after childbirth. It was about returning to yourself, to your power, to your voice. Ethan offered to fund the first year, but she refused. "This one," she said, "needs to stand on its own." Instead, she gathered sponsors who understood the mission, built a team of organizers who had lived the journey themselves, and opened applications to women across the country. The first year, she expected maybe 100 attendees. Instead, over 1,000 applied. She read every application personally. Some made her cry, others made her furious, but all of them made her certain that she was doing the right thing. The summit was scheduled for the following spring, but in her heart, it had already begun. In every woman who sent in her story, in every mentor who volunteered, in every small step taken towards something bigger, and in the quiet moments, late at night, when her daughter finally slept and the house went still, she would sit by the window with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and imagine the room where all of those women would gather one day, not to be inspired, but to be seen.